all of these characters and plots and circumstances are ones that put pressure on this idea of what is dignity, both at the level of the individual and of the agent, but also at the level of institutions. And so you have a sort of nationalist idea of dignity, you have a socialist idea of dignity, you have a liberal idea of dignity, you have someone for whom dignity is about the market, the free market, and letting the free market somehow take over is the best way to honor that dignity. And throughout this life that takes place in the 20th century, you see the pressures from these different understandings of dignity on the one that I was holding on to, but where the book also becomes a way of showing the limits of that view.
It's wonderful to see so many of you here on a cold, frigid Toronto night, snowbound, and it's just a testament, obviously, to the subject, Indignity, but obviously our guest and our speaker. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to introduce her and the subject of her talk. The idea of dignity is a vital concern in many philosophical traditions. The modern liberal conception posits the inherent worth of all human beings. Other notions, such as the dignity of labor in the socialist tradition, demand that we recognize the value of work and compensate workers fairly. Conservatives seem to have a different idea or meaning in mind when they discuss the dignity of the family or the nation. And then there's the dignity of authority, of the state. We commonly describe those who hold high public office as dignitaries. These examples appear to stand in contrast to the more democratic conceptions I just mentioned, implying a hierarchy of status or distinction among members of a community in terms of the offices they hold, more akin to the aristocratic idea of honor. So how should we understand these diverse conceptions of human dignity? What does it mean to sustain one's dignity amid great upheavals in history, as happened in interwar Europe, when mass war, the collapse of empires, and the rise of nation-states uprooted families, tore societies apart, and turned millions of citizens into refugees who were forced to adopt new political identities in exile? How do the ghosts of the 20th century resonate today, as the movement of peoples and the closure of borders generate new struggles over national belonging? And what can we learn from the past that might expand our commitment to freedom and the ethic of responsibility to combat new forms of indignity that we see all around us? Our guest this evening tackles many questions like these in her scholarship. Lea Ypi is the Ralph Miliband Professor of Politics and Philosophy at the London School of Economics and a Fellow of the British Academy, the Wissenschaftenkolleg in Berlin, and the Albanian Academy of Sciences. Born and raised in Albania, she studied philosophy and literature at the University of Rome, earning a PhD from the European University Institute before beginning her postdoctoral studies in Oxford. Professor Ypi is the author of acclaimed scholarly books, which have garnered academic distinction in her field of political philosophy. Their topics range enormously widely, from the character of reason in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, to a novel account of how partisanship can enrich democratic life, to how avant-garde political agents can motivate their fellow citizens to support global justice. But just 5 years ago, she published a philosophical memoir, which brought her ideas to a wider audience. Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. Free, Coming of Age at the End of History won the 2022 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize and the slightly foxed First Biography Prize, which is a story in itself, the title anyway. Remarkably, it has been translated into more than 35 languages. Her latest book, which is the subject of her lecture this evening, is Indignity, A Life Reimagined. Lea will speak for about half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with her to explore some of the themes raised by her talk and in this book, and I think some of the ones that were raised in her previous book, Free, before we open the floor to your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Lea Ypi.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm going to start not with a book, but with a sentence from a poem from the German poet Friedrich Schiller. And the sentence is, "Beautiful world, where are you?" And this poem is called The Gods of Greece, and it was written just before the French Revolution, and it's a lament for the lost harmony of classical Greece and an expression of longing for a time in which human beings were closer to each other and to divine, and where morality was not fractured from beauty, and there was a kind of harmony between nature and spirit. And Schiller describes in this poem a world that was riven by alienation, gods have fled, and human beings find themselves to navigate disenchantment. And actually, it's a world that's not so dissimilar, the world he describes, from our own, which is increasingly violent and fractured and marked by loss of faith in humanity. But there was one difference, as Schiller saw it. In his world, there was hope. And that hope came in the redeeming power of arts and in its capacity to mediate between feelings and moral imperatives. So the question that is behind my book project, about which I'm going to tell you in a minute, is where do we find hope in the world in which we live? And to try and answer this question, I'm going to take you on a journey away from the classical Greek unity ideal that Schiller describes in this poem, and from this utopia of reconciliation into the dystopia of the book project, which is set in modern Greece and in Thessaloniki, Salonika, and is about the life of a woman called Lea Ypi, my grandmother, who was born in Salonika in 1918, a few years before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and who died in Albania in 2006, a few years after the collapse of communism. So it's the life of a woman who spans from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to the interwar period, to the rise of fascism, Nazism, communism, and then the fall of communism and also neoliberalism. And I started this project when a relative texted me and said, "Have you noticed that your grandmother has become viral on Facebook?" So I went on Facebook and discovered a photo of her that I had never seen before. And it was, I don't know if you can see the photo here. I can't see it. Hopefully you can see it. And this is a photo of her as a young woman next to my grandfather. Judging by, it's a photo that's taken in a ski resort, because you can see there are some skis in the background. And she's wearing this fancy, glamorous fur, and she's smiling in the camera. And I figured, after looking at this photo for a little bit, that it was taken during her honeymoon in Cortina d'Ampezzo in the Italian Alps, and I knew that her honeymoon had taken place in the winter of 1941. I had never seen any photos from this period of her life, because I had also been told that all the records of my grandmother's youth disappeared when the police arrested her husband, my grandfather, at the end of World War II in Albania for agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British intelligence officers. But I had heard lots of stories about this honeymoon, and she often described it as the happiest time of her life. And I've often wondered, what does it mean to say that you're the happiest person in the world and this is the happiest time of your life in the winter of 1941? When World War II, as you know, was raging all over Europe. But there was nothing left to search, and there was not really anything for me to find out until this photo appeared on this Facebook post by this random stranger, followed by a lot of derogatory comments and people saying that this was a photo of a communist spy. Some people said it was a photo of a fascist spy. Some people said it was both. And it raised for me the question of legacy and the question of truth of her life, and also ultimately of dignity, which is the philosophical subject of the book. Because my grandmother had, although she's always told me stories about her life, and it was a life of ups and downs, as you will hear in a minute, she also always told me that there was one thing that throughout these upheavals she never lost, and that was her dignity. And to find this photograph online and to find her dignity somehow shred to pieces by these strangers prompted this urge to somehow find the source and find the truth and see whether there was anything to these comments or whether there was something else that one could say about this life that would somehow vindicate her dignity and take it back from the online trolls. And there was only one way of finding this truth, which was to return to the source. And the source, as it happened, turned out to be an office called Authority for Information and Documentation Concerning the State Security Service, which is where surveillance files of people who were followed during communist Albania are kept, and where I was told also these photos that had been confiscated from her would be kept. So this is where the book starts. This is her surveillance file, and that's her on the other side in her ski resort, one of the photos that was also contained in this file. And in the book, the story of Leman is told by relying on two distinct temporal narratives. So one is a first-personal account in which I talk about the experience of searching for the truth of my grandmother's life by narrating the series of visits to the Secret Service archives with the idea that I would try and piece together what there is about her life and piece together the truth of her life. And in this part of the book, the narrator writes in the first person and tries to juxtapose, expectations and findings. You have hypotheses, and you see if they're borne out. And the problem of dignity is closely connected to the question of truth. So who was spying on my grandmother? What motives did they have? Why was my grandfather arrested? What justification was given by the spies, and so on? And that's because in many societies that are divided by the legacy of the past, there is a kind of naive belief that knowing the truth about what happened to someone, what was done, what was being said, will help you reconcile with this past injustice. And only after finding the truth one eventually bring the kind of harmony that I mentioned at the beginning society longs for, and will also eventually restore the dignity of the victims. And after that has been done, as I say, the truth is closely connected, and dignity is closely connected to truth, and truth is closely connected to reconciliation. But as this part of the book shows, that only works if there is a truth to find, and if you can trust the mechanisms through which that truth is transmitted. And as it happens, and as I discovered, and you'll hear in a minute, actually the archive contains very little objective truth, very little objective data. And that's where the second way in which the story is told is important, and where it becomes a third-person narrative, a kind of novelized account of my grandmother's life, starting from her childhood to her coming of age, and then to eventually her arrival in Albania. So Indignity as a whole is in part a kind of mystery novel, in part a family saga, in part a political history of Europe from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to the rise of communism in the Balkans, and in part a philosophical text around the moral and political meanings of dignity, which asks what does it mean to find dignity, what does it mean to defend dignity in a time of extremes, like the time in which she lived, but which also asks the question, what does it mean to pose this investigation at a time when your own age is an age of extremes, and where the narrator no longer trusts the superiority of the present to the past? So the main character of the book is Leman, my grandmother, the person in the photo, and she was born in Salonika, as I said, in 1918, was the granddaughter of an Ottoman administrator. That is her grandfather. And she was of Albanian origin, but at home everyone spoke French, as all aristocrats did in those days. And until she was 18 years old, she had never visited the state of Albania. And actually, as it happens, the year in which she was born, 1918, Albania wasn't even a state, because Greece had annexed the south, Serbia the north, France and Italy contended a few scattered towns in the west, and Bulgaria and Austro-Hungary were laying claims to the rest. So as a teenager, she was sent to study in the French Lycée of Salonika, where she was the only girl in a school of mostly Sephardic Jews. This is Salonika in the 1930s, more or less when she was growing up there. And Sephardic Jews were at that time the largest group in the city. Salonika was still a cosmopolitan melting pot, had been one of the most important trading, commercial, and diplomatic centers of the Ottoman Empire. So she was speaking French and hanging out with these boys, these Ladino boys in the French Lycée, and they taught her to speak in Ladino, and they taught her to smoke the cigar, which she started doing when she was 14. At the age of 20, she went to Tirana, to Albania, which by then was an independent state, or at least was recognized as such by the League of Nations. And she was the first woman to work in the Albanian administration, and also very likely the first woman to propose marriage to a man. And this happened, the man was the man in the photo, her husband. This happened in the wedding of King Zog, who was the self-proclaimed monarch of Albania around the 1930s. And this is my grandfather, who was a law graduate from the Sorbonne and the son of a prominent conservative and eventually collaborationist prime minister of Albania, though he himself was a socialist who had been studying in Paris and was very closely involved with the Popular Front. So in 1946, after the war was over, she took up Albanian citizenship and she participated in the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which were the first elections in which women could vote and the last elections in which non-communist candidates ran for office. After those elections, very shortly after, her husband was arrested and charged with agitation and propaganda and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And this is the prison site where he spent those 15 years. A year after her husband was arrested, a file on her was opened by this secret security branch of the Interior Ministry, and she was placed under surveillance, suspected of being a Greek spy. And she was deported before reaching the age of 30, forced to work in labor camps. Twice a year she would visit, she was a single mother at that point, twice a year she would visit her husband in prison, and 4 times a year she would be summoned to the security offices with an offer to become an informant. So this is more or less the story that the book tells, and initially I had thought about the project as a non-fiction reconstruction of the story of my grandmother, which would place her documents and her life and the files from the archive in context and raise the questions that were raised by the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then the background of World War I, 1929 financial crisis, and these different ideological projects that all were fascism, liberalism, socialism, raising claims on the dignity of the people. But when I started working on the book proposal and during my visits to the Secret Service archives, I came across several mistakes in the files. And the most puzzling of all was that she was reported as a widow. There was no sign of my father in the files. And also that her file was closed with a death certificate that dated from 1954. And since I was living with her for a long time, I grew up with her and I was not born in 1954, there was something really strange, and there was a kind of strange mismatch between the file and what I knew about her life. And I was told, don't worry, this is, sometimes there was a fake, someone from the Secret Service would introduce a fake death certificate to spare her from being further surveilled. Sometimes some people said maybe one of the spies was in love with her and had decided to save her. And in the end, all of these interpretations turned out to be incorrect. I'm not going to say why, because it would be a massive plot spoiler on the book, but I will only say that the mistake couldn't be explained by the usual excuses, and also because one of the spies who was following her was eventually convicted and executed himself for giving false information to the state. And the broader point that I'm trying to convey is that I had gone to the files to try and find the truth about my grandmother, but had actually discovered another layer of interpretation, and with that, another story. And this problem wasn't limited to the Albanian archives, because the more archives I was adding to my research in hope of finding the truth about my grandmother's life, the more I discovered that there is only a truth to find if you can trust the mechanisms and the power that structures the archive for you. And that was not the case. So in Albania, it was secret services, a communist system that had constructed the archive in a certain way. In Greece, I was told that the evidence around the Ottoman Empire had disappeared in the various waves of nationalism that had destroyed the evidence from the imperial period and created a narrative of the city as just a Greek city, and so erased all evidence of these other communities that had also lived in Salonika around then. In Italy, I was told that it was really hard to find records of women because women weren't juridical subjects, and so you had to look for the husband or the father or the uncle or whatever. So in the end, one of the most fascinating aspects of this search weren't the facts of my grandmother's life, but the kinds of things that the archive was not telling me. So the silences and the erasures and all the things that I wouldn't find out. And so it became really important for me not just to find the facts, but to try and reconstruct the world that led to facts, some facts disappearing and other facts being included, and so to these decisions. And what was really important was also to see what were the broader historical forces that led to this life going in the way in which it did. And there, both in Greece and in Albania, you could really see the impact on the archives, the impact on the authorities of truth of these politics of the 1930s, which was the 1920s and 30s, which was a politics of what was then called the unmixing of peoples. So this was the famous sentence by Lord Curzon, who urged people to try and return to this homogeneous nation-state principle and to dismantle this cosmopolitan, multicultural, imperial identities. It was a politics in which international institutions had been created to try and cope with the legacy of World War I and were all also being dismantled. It's a politics in which the left abandons internationalism, and so is increasingly also wedded to the nation-state, both in its social democratic and in its communist version. And it's a politics where you begin to see the rise of the minority question in international law. So first as a question, then minorities increasingly perceived as a threat, and then increasingly scapegoated, and eventually leading to the full-blown fascism that we are all familiar with from that period. So to try and capture all of this, both the things that I was encountering in the files and all those other elements that I was not encountering, all the mysteries that I came across and the world that led to those mysteries, I decided to change the method for which I would write the book. So rather than just write about the woman that I knew and picking out the bits of information that were relevant to her, I would, and rather than just chasing the known facts of her life, I decided to try and give voice to all the silences of the archive as well, and so to articulate what was missing from the files and the reasons that, for which it was missing. Because of many of these fragmented lives that I was encountering in the files, many of the people, many of the characters that I was meeting in these files had died without leaving descendants, and their legacy really disappeared with their death. And so instead of somehow adopting and continuing with my grandmother and the grandmother story and canceling out all the lives that were irrelevant to the story, I decided to adopt all these other characters as well, and so to give them the legacy and the question of dignity, to vindicate their dignity as well, by changing the method with which I would write the book. So rather than writing about a granddaughter and a grandmother, I would write as an author and use the method of literature to try and give voice to all these other characters that had left no descendants and that had nobody who could actually reflect on their dignity. So this is one of the surveillance files, that the way they appear and what I encountered in the files. And this just leads me to end with the question with which I started, which is what is the possibility of engaging and learning from the past under conditions of present injustice? And there, my dilemma and the answer, I suppose, is the same as the one that Schiller gives. The modern world, the world I was coming across, is very much a world of loss and disenchantment and of lack of reconciliation, and of a political system that doesn't really contribute to give authenticity to people and to reconstruct dignity from this perspective of integrity. And where the answer is perhaps not the kind of truth that you find in the files and the reconstruction of a life with access just to that truth, and where reconciliation isn't really just about reaching the end of a process, but it's really about thinking about what kind of truth you find while reconstructing relations with other humans looking forward. So rather than looking backward, you think about how art can help bring about the kind of reconciliation that is missing in politics. And so Schiller's answer in this poem that I just started, in The Gods of Greece, was that art has a power to redeem the lost perspectives and to redeem these lost voices and to fill the silences of history. And the perspective that I try to adopt in the book is very much a similar one, where literature becomes the vehicle through which, through dialogue, through plot, through construction, you can bring all these characters that history cannot capture because they have been eliminated by history. And that's what the book tries to establish from a philosophical perspective. So dignity isn't something that you find out there, but the effort to preserve your moral compass in a way, in a world that doesn't really reflect your moral imperatives and actually conspires against that. So what literature does from this other point of view, better than history, better than access to the files, is to give a place to the imagination alongside the moral and political imperatives. And so when that is the case, and this is really my last few sentences, and that's also the conclusion of the book, you can see there's a split screen here. One is the reality, the historical truth. It's my grandmother as an old woman and me as a child. The other one is the life reimagined and the stories that I had tried to put together with this effort to, through the imagination, recover this lost perspective. The story with which I started, which is the truth about my grandmother's life, in the end is only in part in the reconstruction of the known facts about her, because just as valuable becomes the interpretation of the facts and the voices that they resurrect and the kind of moral light that this different art perspective brings on the world. And so the kind of catharsis that you get there isn't a catharsis that depends on the closure from the past, but on reflection on how things could be different in the future. And that's why the word indignity, which gives the title to the book, actually only occurs once in the very final sentence. And it says that it's indignity that is defied through the imagination. So that's it. Thank you.
I read this book paired with Lea's own memoir about her own life, straddling what Fukuyama called the end of history, before and after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. And they read incredibly well as a pair, because Free is dedicated to your grandmother. And I was really struck that dignity and freedom are two concepts, two ideas that run through both in all kinds of interesting ways. So lots of questions to ask. The first, let's say where you began. You were seeking the truth in the archive, and you said that the archives, and you talk like a lot of historians do, the archives are silent about many things. They're certainly silent about how people feel, what they thought, how they experience certain things. They're also silent about facts, so you interrogate many of the facts, and you discover many, as some people would say, the wrong facts, the alternative facts that exist in the world. But in some cases, you also say that the facts actually get in the way of a proper interpretation. And you mentioned that in your lecture. And so you approach the archives philosophically. And there's a really nice phrase in the book where you say, it's really important to use our judgment when we approach the archives. And you define judgment as the free play between feeling and reason. Could you say a little bit more about how you did that? What choices did you make? What dilemmas did you confront? How did you try to reconcile them?
Yeah, so for me, the problem arose when I realized that you couldn't trust the facts, or that you couldn't trust the kinds of questions that the facts prompted. And so one of the things that, especially when you're dealing with Secret Service archives and communist systems and transitional societies, the most important question that people ask is, who is the spy? Mm-hmm. So who was surveilling? You're reading all these files, and the most important question is, do you want to know the individual that was directly responsible for causing this harm to your grandmother? And I very quickly realized that actually just knowing the name of an individual wouldn't really help me understand why what happened happened. Because you could replace that individual with another individual, and the structure would be the same, and the general pattern would be the same, and the dynamic would be the same. So it seemed to me that if you're after this problem of dignity, or if you're trying to think about, and the philosophical question of this book is very much connected to the philosophical question of the previous book. The previous book is about free. There are different ideas of freedom. There's one particular idea of freedom that's my grandmother embodies there, which she's a character in that book as well. and that's the idea of freedom as moral agency. And then Indignity really continues this search for, well, what does it mean to have this idea of freedom as moral agency in a world of unfreedom, in a world where the political system constantly fails people to realize. And of course, you also understand that if that's your question, and it's a philosophical question, the archive, which is always constructed from the point of view of power, from the point of view of a particular standpoint, from the point of view of an elite that has an interest in you reading the story in a certain way, the question of dignity is completely irrelevant, and in fact will be suppressed most of the time, because it's not going to be at the front of this search. So if you're actually after dignity understood in these moral terms, it becomes a moral question, and it requires an approach to history that's a moral approach, and it's exactly the approach that history understood as politics, as leaders, as institutions, is trying to avoid. And so there, the effort, and this is where I was speaking about the method of the book, and this effort to give a hybrid. There's a part of the book that's non-fiction, straight, the files, what you read in the files, what she finds, what questions the files prompt, what questions they don't prompt, and that only goes so far. And then you have this parallel track where it's a novelist who is trying to read microhistory by thinking about moral motives, choices, psychological complexity, complicity, and all the kinds of dynamics that the archive and the facts constructed from the point of view of this power structure are deliberately trying to avoid. And this standpoint that it's only the imagination that can bridge between these moral ideals on the one hand and feelings and micro and lives on the other that can do that work.
So every archive would have these silences, but would it be the case, this is a communist regime, so the archive there would, the mechanisms of power that silence and obscure and manipulate knowledge and reality would be far more pernicious.
Yeah, but for me, it wasn't just about the point of view of power as that power. For me, it was also really important, what is it that power in the present wants me to get from these files? Because one of the really interesting questions about engaging with Secret Service files in the present is the discourse around access to the files is also completely instrumentalized by elites in power. So it's a discourse that's constantly weaponized, where people are always saying, such and such contemporary politician has a past of being a spy and a surveillance officer and has this shadowy, dark past, and we need to uncover that and we need to call out their complicity in the system. And I think somehow this stands in the way of the real resolving of the problems of historical injustice, because you don't understand the complexity of that system if you reduce it to the contributions of particular individuals. And so for me, it wasn't just a question of the archive, the files that were compiled then are not giving me the answers. It was also that the power in the present somehow was pushing me to engage with the files in a certain way, and maybe that way of engaging with the files was not the one that was conducive and contributing to this problem of dignity and to resolving it.
And yet you resisted that compulsion
So,
by interrogating the archive in the way in which you did, and trying to, as the title of the book says, to reimagine this life, given the other knowledge you had. I mean, there's so many characters in this book, and they really come to life. I mean, it's a very literary book, and at times I had to, I mean, the passage from the literary imaginative reconstruction in many spaces to here's a document, and even the text, the font changes, so now you realize, okay, this is the archive. It's done very, very fluently, and yet when you were doing that, you must have been going between these two different registers constantly, right?
Yeah, exactly, and it was also important for me that both were there. That there's this sense that when the reader gets the book, actually they don't really know what's fact and what's fiction. And I had the same impression when I received the files.
Right.
I didn't really know what was made up and what was true, because a lot of the information that I was finding didn't quite match what I knew. And so I was thinking, well, am I now in the realm of some kind of reality that I really need to trust and I just happen to not know this? Or is this someone's construction, as someone who's just made up and is giving me this information and I now have to access this information as though it were the truth, but actually it's someone's creative intervention? And so it was really important to have both perspectives, because although I then made the decision to go with literature, I also didn't want to say this is just literature. It was important that there was a basis of history there and a basis in truth, and that the reader would understand that this was a problem at the level of the form of the book. So what I try to convey, and that what sometimes frustrates readers, is exactly this idea that now you're in the present and you're reading a file, now you're in Salonika and you're hearing the canaries singing and the sea is there and she's walking by the sea with his aunt and he's eating these sweets and so on. And it was very important that both voices were there, because that's how I felt you could have a more complete perspective on truth, by having these plurality of standpoints, where you have the standpoint of the archive and of facts and power on the one hand, and on the other hand, the standpoint of a writer who is trying to bring to life these lives that are lost and that the archive doesn't capture in their individuality. And again, exactly because I thought sometimes for me, you read the files and you think there is a creation there, and so it looks like it's a fiction. The archive is itself a kind of fiction. And maybe there is more truth to the fiction that tells you that this is fiction, as opposed to the archive that's pretending to give you the truth. So literature is giving you, starting with a lie by telling you this is made up, it's fiction, it's my reimagining or my imagining, and the reader knows that that's imagination. But maybe in that effort of the imagination to capture all these perspectives, there is more integrity and there's more authenticity than in the source, which tells you I am the truth and you trust me, and where in fact it's deceiving you. And it was very important to me to have this play constantly and to convey the play at the level of form.
So your grandmother has a very Kantian understanding of freedom, to be a moral agent, to make these choices, and that relates to the understanding of dignity as well. But as you mentioned even in your talk, there are many different understandings of dignity in this book. So for those who haven't read it, can you say a little bit about, so she has one, and there's a very nice quote. Actually, this is from Free, but it's the same meaning in Indignity. You say, for your grandmother, dignity was something in the human spirit that withstood all attempts at offense, injury, and humiliation. It has nothing to do with money, honors, or titles. I am the same person I always was, and I still like whiskey. And so that sounds like a very kind of stoic understanding, because huge misfortunes befall your grandmother, and actually many in your family, and of course your husband, your grandfather, Aslan. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this aspect. I don't know how much we can talk about characters in the book, because there's a very important figure, historical figure, who is responsible for his misfortune. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about that? Because he seems to also have a very, I don't know if you call it stoic, but he has a similar understanding of what dignity requires, and he acts with great dignity, mm-hmm. but he suffers tremendously, and so does your grandmother, but he's in prison for 15 years. Can you say a little bit about that moment in the book?
Well, so they're, in a way, both of them are kind of Kantian characters, and I suppose they are the characters in the book, or the people, whichever way you want to read them, as characters or as people, the protagonists, with whom I have most affinity in terms of how they understand freedom and its relationship to politics, to institutions. So they have this very Kantian idea of freedom is about morality, it's about moral agency, it's about doing the right thing, and yet they are in a world in which nothing of that idea of freedom is reflected in political institutions, and that's partly the problem. They are constantly failed by the world in which they live, because the world in which they live is a world of indignity. But I also wanted to, in the book, convey all these different understandings of dignity. So this is one understanding, is the Kantian one, but there is a Stoic understanding, and there is a character who actually commits a Stoic suicide at some point, because she wants to kind of extricate herself from nature. And for the Stoics, freedom, the ultimate act of freedom, was to kill yourself, and because that's how you liberated yourself from nature. There is another character who is a kind of Nietzschean take on dignity, and so he has an idea that morality is just a form of power exercise, and it's just power relations, and it's just, with a Thrasymachus objection to Socrates, justice is just the will of the stronger, and there's nothing else to be said. And it was important in the book for me to, through character and through plot, to talk about this, and also to talk about the question of dignity and legacy. So the book starts with her grandfather who overeats baklava and then dies, and he's a pasha, as you saw, and so there's this question of how does a dignified life, or the life of a dignitary, connect to their death, and what is the legacy? And his wife is very upset because she's very worried that she's not going to be able to say that he had a dignified death.
It's a very undignified
kind
death.
of very comic death.
Yeah.
And so for me, all of these characters and plots and circumstances are ones that put pressure on this idea of what is dignity, both at the level of the individual and of the agent, but also at the level of institutions. And so you have a sort of nationalist idea of dignity, you have a socialist idea of dignity, you have a liberal idea of dignity, you have someone for whom dignity is about the market, the free market, and letting the free market somehow take over is the best way to honor that dignity. And throughout this life that takes place in the 20th century, you see the pressures from these different understandings of dignity on the one that I was holding on to, but where the book also becomes a way of showing the limits of that view.
And so what are the limits for you? One of the things that struck me was, so your grandmother and your grandfather act with great stoicism as dignity. They make choices not entirely aware, as most human agents can't be, of the foreseeable consequences of their action. There's this one crucial moment we mentioned there's one character who's a German businessman who Lea's grandmother intensely dislikes for all kinds of reasons that are obvious once you read the book, why she would intensely dislike him. But at this crucial moment, is it 1946 or 47? In the book, the communists have entrenched themselves into power, and both your grandmother and grandfather, who's a socialist, are at risk from this regime of being punished very severely. And this character, this German businessman, makes an offer to her, that there's a way out. You can leave Albania now with me, and you can rescue yourself, you can rescue your family. And she doesn't, right? And then she pays a heavy price. And one of the quotes at the beginning of the book is from Kant about, I can't remember this quote exactly, about the price of dignity. And she resists that, and she makes a fateful choice. And then Aslan, your grandfather, is imprisoned, and he suffers greatly. How did she, in the memories you have or the conversations you had with her, how did she try to reconcile that fateful decision to then what happened to her and what happened to him?
So for me, the question that always came up, this was one of the episodes of her life where you could read everything that came after from this one choice that she made deliberately. So trying to basically resist a Nazi collaborator offering to leave Albania. And she says, I'm not a collaborator, you're a collaborator. I don't want to leave because I'm not a Nazi. Why should I leave my country? I haven't done anything wrong. Right. And then, of course, from this single moment, you could trace everything that happened. Her husband gets arrested, she gets deported, she ends up having this very miserable life. And the interesting question is the question of guilt. And I always asked her, well, did you feel guilty about this? And clearly she had felt guilty because she just made the wrong call. And, but on the other hand, it was also a way of seeing, on the one hand, the kind of limitations of the position that's just a principled position that says, I'm going to do the right thing no matter what. I don't need to care about the consequences. I don't need to worry about the consequences. I don't know the consequences. And she was taking a risk, and she followed the principle, and then the principle produced this kind of tragic outcome. On the other hand, whenever she elaborated on this, somehow she had made peace with this, because of course it was a whole life of... And I always thought that whenever she recounted this episode, she decided deliberately to avoid the question of guilt so that she could teach me a moral lesson about living with dignity and accepting the consequences. And it was really interesting that she never reflected back on this episode saying, I regretted it, or I should have done something different. She always said, no, I did it, I made my decision, I own to the consequences of my decision, but here is what you can learn about it. And of course, what you could learn about it is very difficult, and in part, the book is a reflection on actually what you can learn, because there is nothing you can learn about this particular life. She made her decisions, that was it. It's not clear whether this was a dignified or non-dignified decision, whether she affirmed her dignity in that, or whether she betrayed, let down someone else. And for me, it was also a way of, again, seeing the limitations of this perspective that only thinks about the individual and the choice and the responsibility of the individual, divorced from the kind of social structure in which all those decisions come. And it was partly what also made me write this book, actually, this question about this Kantian idea of freedom, which is freedom as moral agency. The moral agent is core. In the end, only works if the actions of that agent are inserted into a moral world, where you have relations of freedom and you have relations of responsibility such that you can actually affirm this conception. But if the world is not responsive to that, then the moral question of dignity becomes a political question. And that's,
Right.
I've always thought this was the limit of her view. It was a very, again, very moralistic view, but which didn't really ask itself the question of, but where do these moral choices fit in? And how does the world enable or constrain those choices? And what happens to then to the individual who needs to own up to those choices?
So if we want to have a politics of dignity, then that question is thrown back onto the collective, right? Because we as individuals can make very brave moral decisions and suffer the consequences of indignity. So an act of dignity can produce these indignities that we suffer, but we suffer them because of the societies we live in, the historical forces that we're contending with, and so on. Because I can see what you're saying. You know, your grandmother says another point. She doesn't believe in luck. Luck, I guess you could even say bad luck, is just a denial of responsibility by another name. So this is the sort of sentiment you were explaining.
Yeah, and so just to comment on that, she had very much, and she was a moral hero in many ways. And she has the moral hero's perspective. But I think it would be better to live in a world where there is no need for moral heroes,
Yes.
where actually politics works in such a way that these exemplars of virtue teach you something about how to engage with politics in the present, but actually ideally you live in a world where freedom is something that's enabled by social structures. And so those kinds of heroic acts are not needed. And that's why, for me, this moral question of dignity in the book becomes a political question, but it becomes a political question that returns in the form of how do we engage with the past? How do we think about history? How do we think about past injustice? And what are the mechanisms that enable us to engage with the past in a way that helps us now in the present, in the politics of the present? And
Right.
what is the function? And therefore, this perspective of blaming or of ascribing responsibility or finding the individuals can in many ways be limited, because it makes you think of the past and the present as somehow divided from each other. And so you have this standpoint where you think, well, the present is superior to the past, and so all I need to do now is return back and blame or ascribe responsibility or find agents that were responsible. Whereas if you think of them in a continuum, and if you think that actually maybe the present is just as likely as the past to reproduce its tragedies. And we're now at a point where you really see exactly those patterns of, population displacement or
Yes.
Manipulation of identities or instrumentalization or scapegoating of different ethnic groups. Then you begin to think, well, maybe the present isn't actually much better than what she lived through. And the question becomes, what can I learn from her standpoint and from the limits of that standpoint to try and understand the world in which I live and where those lessons of history can actually help me in the present.
Yes, so that's the implication for our politics, right?
Yeah.
That if we believe in the value and the necessity of dignity, that the onus of responsibility falls back on us, rather than praising as the heroism of an individual person who's suffering great indignities with a great measure of dignity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have one final question, because I know there's so many here and there must be many questions. And that's, you write sort of rigorous, serious books of philosophy, and you've written several, but then you've written 2 memoirs now. And interwoven, like I said, in really beautiful ways. I know you didn't conceive it this way, but it really sort of feels like it's, I don't know, there's a trilogy here. But there's certainly 2 books that really should be read together. And so, they're both, well, this one is a detective story at one level, and then it's a philosophy of ideas. What is it that memoir as a genre, and then even within the genre of memoir, as you've said, there's lots of different forms that it takes, lots of techniques you use, the basis of the claims you make, these are all very, very diverse. What is it that memoir allows you to do in terms of exploring philosophical and political ideas and arguments? I mean, one is it's a larger audience of readers, which is wonderful. But is there something else that this form allows you to understand with the ideas that you're actually grappling with?
Yeah, I think maybe, and it's maybe something that's not just exclusive to memoir, but I think of literature maybe more generally. And so, and I think what it does is that it enables you to think about ideas as embodied. And so you have, on the one hand, ideas are always have a life in history. And that history can either be macro history, where you study politicians, institutions, great paradigms of regime change and so on. So it's all also abstract in its way, it's macro history. And then you have micro history, so you have the effects of exactly those same things on the lives of people, on their decisions, on their tragedies, on the choices that they make, on how their life goes this way or that way. And I actually think every life out there, including our lives now, are constantly shaped by the macro. They're always at the mercy of what happens at the geopolitical level or at the level of markets or structures of the economy or social structures. And I think what's interesting about literature is that it enables you to explore those ideas and to see also the limitations of ideas in context and to see where they go wrong, how individuals make decisions, how they see them from the inside, and to contextualize them, and to add a kind of layer of complexity and nuance that doesn't sit very easily, because when you do philosophy, you always start with a theory and you want to show that you have the right theory and the adversary or the critic is wrong, and you start by wanting to prove your theory, and it's very much like, you start with a position and you want to show the truth of that position. Right. And so I always say philosophy is the kind of realm of certainty. And what I really like about literature is that it's a realm of doubt. So you start like I do, I have this Kantian idea of freedom, or have this Kantian idea of dignity, and then put pressure on that idea and see how that shows up in lives and in character and in plot and in detail. And that's where the questions come. And if the work is good, it also raises the same questions for the reader and takes them on a journey, and it becomes like, I always joke, it's like democracy in action, where you have a view and it's constantly problematized, and literature enables you to problematize that. You couldn't do that with philosophy. You can't start with the same doubt and maintain that level of doubt. And also, equally, if you were to write literature with the sense of, I want to show which one is the right idea of dignity, for example, you would write very propagandistic, or you would write very bad literature. Right. So it's only good literature if it's complex. Even if there is a view out there, as I'm often convinced that there is one character I like more, but then if I want to write other characters credibly, I need to give them just as much attention. So when I write a Nazi character, I have to really enter the world of a Nazi and think like him. And it's actually really hard to do, but I find it also very productive, because it forces you to really take seriously someone who thinks really differently from you. And in that sense, I think it is like prefiguring democracy in a way, because that's what exchanging political views looks when it's at its best, and you try and understand, why did this person come to those horrible decisions? Yeah. What was it in their lives, in their biography, in the way they were brought up, in their socialization, in their education, in the books they read, that made him come up with those views about this and that. And as a writer, it's really hard to, as I say, write characters that you profoundly disagree with, but somehow they need to be credible characters. People need to read them and find something that they have empathy for.
Yeah, there's an ambivalence that comes through in the book at certain key moments that raises all these questions in a more profound way. Makes me think of all the times I had someone read and say, I don't buy the argument, sort of say you should have written some literature instead. Thank you so much, Lea. I wanted to open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you.